Hello, everybody. My name is Abshir. I'm the Role UK Program Coordinator here at Advocates for International Development. Thank you for joining. Before we start, I'll say a few words about the panel. Throughout the pandemic, we've seen a shift in the very nature of how international legal pro bono is being coordinated, practiced, and received. Our panel today is made up of esteemed speakers who've been delivering legal aid and pro bono across the world. And I, for one, am looking forward to hearing their experiences and forecasts for the future. Chairing this panel today is the Director of Lawyers Against Poverty, Emma Luff. Emma oversees LAP's strategic operations and has over 10 years experience working on human rights and access to justice in the nonprofit sector. And before I hand over to Emma, just some points of housekeeping. Please feel free to send your questions into the questions and answers box, which you'd like speakers to answer, and do use the like button to express your interest in questions that you would like answered. Without further ado, I will now pass on to Emma.
Thank you, Abshir. First of all, I'm delighted to be chairing this panel on coordinating pro bono to gather strategic insights from our panelists representing initiatives around the world. Lawyers Against Poverty is a global movement of lawyers and members of the wider legal community committed to the alleviation of poverty, and with an ambition to bring together a global network of social justice advocates who offer their time and expertise as volunteers and financial assistance through LAP's Justice Fund. We're always keen to hear from others about how we can progress our coordination efforts, both within our network and through wider collaboration. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome a brilliant lineup of panelists today. We have Mariam Faruqi, South Asia Director of iProbono, an organization that leverages the expertise of a wide community of pro bono lawyers to strengthen active citizenship and civil society. We also welcome Sarah Lough, Executive Director of the International Senior Lawyers Project, an organization that provides pro bono assistance to governments, civil society actors, and social enterprises. Next, we welcome Aisha Abdallah, partner and head of pro bono at ELIL Kenya, with a practice that focuses on commercial litigation with an emphasis on fraud, economic crime, and disputes over land, the environment, and natural resources. And finally, we welcome Philip Worthington, Managing Director of European Lawyers in Lesvos, an organization that provides free legal assistance to refugees navigating the asylum process on the island of Lesvos and on the Greek mainland. So a warm welcome to all of our panelists. We're extremely lucky to have representatives from organizations with a range of expertise and unique approaches to the coordination of pro bono globally. So over the next hour or so that we have, we'll hear both international and regionally focused perspectives, and we'll gather learning from a range of approaches that panelists and their respective organizations are taking. So we'll open up the conversation shortly with panelists to talk for about 45 minutes before we open that up to a Q&A. And if you could use the chat function to share any questions you have, and feel free to do that as panelists are speaking, then we'll come to those in the final half hour. And if there are any questions in the chat that you'd particularly like to see answered, then there's also the opportunity to upvote these. So we're going to kickstart with thinking about the context and challenges for coordinating pro bono before moving on to think about the lessons learned and opportunities for the path ahead. So to kick us off, and starting with Sarah, I think we've seen how COVID-19 has exposed inequality in societies around the world. In your work with the International Senior Lawyers Project, and particularly with the multi-stakeholder approach that you take, what have emerged as the most critical issues for you in the past year?
Thank you, Emma. It's wonderful to be here with this wonderful panel of speakers, and thanks to A4ID for the invitation. So a little bit further context to Emma's question. Our focus is to mobilize pro bono legal support that really advances economic development in a model that is more inclusive, more transparent and accountable, and more just and sustainable. And one of the key issues that we found during COVID is we needed to adapt first and foremost. Our priority was continuing legal support on active matters, making sure our clients and partners did not suffer a disruption in legal support at a time when they not only critically needed it, but were confronting new legal challenges. So we early on made contingency plans back in February of 2020 and started thinking about, okay, what can we do remotely that we can't, when we can't travel, et cetera. So we had to adapt very quickly. And we also were very proactive in reaching out to our partners and our clients. We were offering our support in navigating thorny new legal issues arising from or exacerbated by the economic shutdown, disruption in supply chains. And we developed one thing that I think a lot of us did was we developed a robust portfolio of virtual workshops for governments, civil society organizations, social enterprises on salient topics that were very live issues that they were confronting, such as insolvency and restructuring, loan renegotiations, contract performance, access to capital, and public-private partnerships. We often paired international and local counsel to provide the benefit of comparative experiences and perspectives. We also thought about how ISLP as an organization can contribute to the recovery from the pandemic and from the economic shutdown. So we partnered with Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and with CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiative, and are offering legal support to governments, to low-income governments that want to avail themselves of the vaccine doses, the COVID-19 vaccine dosage that are available to them through the COVAX facility. So we were proactive in that sense. We also responded to emergent issues like the crackdown on media. Our media law working group pretty much jumped into action in terms of coming to the defense and being involved with litigation in defense of dissident journalists that were jailed under cybercrime laws. I think, those were the lessons for us, were to be adaptive and proactive. And we also really relied on the flexibility of funders. I think with development agencies, that was a little trickier. They were constrained in some of their ability to adapt. We saw our scope of work change and narrow in certain instances because certain projects were necessarily paused or change in scope because governments and our civil society partners needed to focus on other priorities and emergencies. So we tried to really, especially given where we are situated as an organization based in New York, we really just tried to keep in good contact and deepen our relationships with partners. And that to me was partnerships and flexibility and adaptability were the key lessons for us as an organization. Probably very much like what many of you have experienced.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Mariam, I know that through your work, you've also come up against changes to financing and new legal issues that have been emerging during the pandemic. Do you have insights on these or other emerging issues to share from iProbono in the South Asia context?
Thanks, Emma, and thanks A4ID team for having us here. And obviously thanks to my co-panelists as well. It's a real privilege to be here with you all today. So very quickly, Emma sort of set the context for our work, but iProbono's mission is really to enable people to access their rights in pursuit of a just society. And well before COVID, our work in South Asia in 5 different countries has clearly exposed the fact that there are two-tier justice systems that we're working against, endemic inequalities across the board. And these were only put into relief during COVID. So I think we reacted in very similar ways to what Sarah has sort of elaborated upon. I think collaborations across our nonprofit sector, whether it was in India or in Nepal or in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka, we realized that we really had to get together with the nonprofit partners that we've been working with over the years and find out what their needs were and partner up more than ever. And Emma, you mentioned financing. That included co-collaborating on sort of whether it was, I'll talk a little bit more about our emergency relief, which was another response to the pandemic, but really partnering up to ensure that our resources were being delivered efficiently in the face of a crisis. I mean, most of us were used to working online to a certain extent, but certainly not to the extent that COVID had sort of brought to us. It took us all out of our offices, out of the field in particular, out of the courtrooms. So initially it was just figuring out how to deal with those issues. But I think that we got over those quite quickly. Most of our teams have been working from home, but at the same time, in the little gaps of time that were possible, attending court where they can and attending online courtrooms as well. I think in terms of critical issues, not being able, apologies, my timer. In terms of critical issues, not being able to attend court was definitely one of them. So what we did do was we engaged more with the judiciary in our different jurisdictions during the pandemic to ensure that clients were getting interim relief, for example, on child sexual abuse matters. And interim relief often means financial support for survivors and their families. So I think that that's an important one. On a totally different note, we contacted a lot of our partners to say, look, we can provide legal support, but what else do you need? And what emerged in India, for example, was food relief was required. So we engaged partners to raise funds outside India and then deploy funds in different phases to deliver meals to the most vulnerable populations, and that included migrant workers, that included bonded laborers, that included women and children from single parent families. And in the first phase of the project, we delivered 6 million meals. I mean, that's something that we've never done before. It's not legal, but it's definitely something that our wider pro bono community was able to engage in, and that's a continuing project. Something else I wanted to talk about was obviously other types of legal support, legal advice and needs that came up. One of them was the needs of migrant workers in a crisis. And I actually, when I looked at the participant list, I saw that our Nepal legal representative, Barun Ghamire, is here. And he very quickly worked with members of his team in Nepal to set up legal aid clinics for migrant workers who needed to return home on an emergency basis. So I've tried to pull together some of the critical issues and sort of what emerged and how we managed to deal with them, which I know that we'll be talking about in a bit. But I think a lot of our issues, whether it's sort of not being able to leave our offices and sort of working in different venues in different ways, keeping up team morale, creative ways of financing, I think they'll be pretty similar across the board. So thanks, Emma.
Thanks very much, Mariam. Moving to Philip, I feel that some of these are going to be very similar, particularly the logistical issues that you've been facing. And you, with your work, bring a more focused regional perspective, and in particular supporting people through the asylum application processes in Lesvos. How far do these feel like common issues to you, or how far did you experience very logistical and geographically specific challenges?
Thanks very much, Emma, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to A4ID and for the invitation, and obviously also to the co-panelists. Yeah, Emma, as you mentioned, we're an organisation that works, directly on the ground. We have a team of full-time Greek asylum lawyers who work together with volunteer European asylum lawyers and non-specialist pro bono lawyers from law firms, who all work together in person to provide legal assistance in Greece. Of course, with COVID-19, that made that model, impossible for a period and very challenging for other times. And what we saw at the same time in terms of critical issues emerging was that, as well as obviously the travel restrictions, movement restrictions on our team, there was also travel restrictions and movement restrictions on refugees. So in Greece, the camps were under and remain under enhanced lockdown. So that restricts the number of people who can leave, also restricts the access of NGOs to the camps. So in effect, restricting access to vital services, including legal assistance. At the same time, the asylum procedure not only carried on, but actually increased in speed. So now interviews take place with only 1 or 2 days notice, whereas before it was weeks or months in pre-pandemic. So at the same time as that, the interviews are going very quickly, and they also have a remote element to them, which is causing major concerns in terms of confidentiality, with people being able to overhear interviews going on, problems in terms of integrity and accuracy of the interviews, with, as we've all experienced, connection cutting, not being able to hear people and things like that. So in that situation, we were faced by actually an enhanced need for legal assistance, but with greater restrictions in place. So from our perspective, it was a case, as the others have mentioned, of trying to navigate that. And the main thing from our perspective was a very practical one, which was one of moving from a purely in-person model to one that was more based on having a remote element. So as lawyers being able to dial in and provide consultations from home, which is something we never did before, but had to learn and adapt to very, very quickly.
Thanks very much, Philip. And moving to Aisha, almost on the other end of the spectrum, with your experience as head of pro bono, and I know your involvement in delivering virtual seminars during the pandemic as well. I wonder if you could share insights on the emerging issues, but from the perspective of facilitating institutional pro bono support during the pandemic.
Okay, so the things we noticed in Kenya during COVID last year was that we felt there were attacks on rule of law, and this was because we had police crackdowns that were seemed to be based on COVID restrictions. So we had a national lockdown starting with our capital, and essentially with very little notice, suddenly we had curfews quite early in the day. We don't have a very good public transport system, so people were finding themselves, on public roads, being caught by the police and being rounded up, beaten up, and arrested and detained. So we felt as a community of lawyers that there was this, sort of crackdown on rule of law, and we needed to push back. Now, the problem was in Kenya, we had essentially, because of the lockdown, the judiciary were sent home, and we were not able to move about. So eventually our Chief Justice sort of released a circular which mandated the courts to move to virtual hearings, and we were then able to operate to a limited extent in terms of civil cases virtually. So the judges sort of got used to using Zoom and then moved to Microsoft Teams. And at least to a limited extent, a number of, the Law Society of Kenya and a number of actors actually moved to court and got some, favorable orders, sort of saying that the government couldn't just restrict personal freedoms without some level of public consultation, that basic fundamental rights and freedoms needed to be respected. So this is something that we found we needed to highlight, and we did so on our platforms. We spoke about it, we wrote about it. And I think we continue to watch out for the erosion of fundamental rights and freedoms using COVID as an excuse. So I just wanted to mention that. And then the other thing we noticed personally in our law firm was that remote working hit our poorest paid staff members the worst. These are the people less able to, they didn't have sort of, a steady supply of electricity at home. So even if you gave them laptops, they really weren't able to perform their tasks at home. These are people who relied on the fact that we gave free lunches in the office to have one hot meal a day. So I say this because I think that I don't want to speak so much about pro bono. I want to speak about our personal experiences and the fact that we realize that there's no point helping outsiders if we don't start with our own staff members. So actually we had to roll out some relief for our own poorer staff members who are stuck at home, who are maybe not getting hot meals a day. So we had ration packs. And then we extended our outreach to neighboring slum areas. So we said there's no point being this, successful law firm operating in Nairobi, and we're not even helping the community next door to us. It doesn't make any sense. So we then worked with some partners who are already on the ground, and logistics was a huge challenge. So we couldn't do the logistics, we just were not suited. But what we could do was collect money, and we did get a lot of staff donations and contributions and from our clients, and we put that together and we bought relief packs. But we sort of supervised the distribution of food, but to a large extent, we just did not have the logistics to do that ourselves. Now, sorry, should I stop there? Because I feel like I'm running ahead. And I don't want to overrun.
That's okay. No, we're going to move next to thinking about the lessons learned. But if you had anything else to add in terms of the challenges, then feel free to continue.
So, I mean, one of the big things we saw is obviously, like most parts of the world, we just did not have laws that allowed us to operate remotely where people were to a large extent sent home. And what we did as a pro bono initiative was we actually compiled a 300-page document with some other law firms, and we sent it to our government, and what it did was it listed a table of laws that needed to be amended during COVID to allow people to operate. It asked for tax reliefs. It sort of protected workers' rights. And this was something we thought the government would struggle to put together very quickly, and we were able to use maybe work that had been done by international law firms in other countries. They looked at specific sectors and they said, these are the changes you need during COVID. So we said, these are the amendments you need to make. Some of these are short term, some of these are longer term. And to some extent, some of that was taken on board. So we did have some tax reliefs. We did have a large impact on employment. So at least the courts were sensible, and they said, to a large extent, we don't want you to litigate COVID related issues. We would like you to talk to your workers and see if you can reach some consensus, because going to court isn't going to be the solution. It's not going to create jobs when there are no jobs and the economy is doing badly. So I think that was quite practical. And then we created a COVID hub, which still we run to this day, and it's a free to access website. And it basically has a list of frequently asked questions, with a drop-down menu, employment, data privacy, all sorts of things that people were sort of asking us. What do I do about my contract? I can't pay. Is there any relief I can get? Is there protection? And what we did was we updated that, and then we sort of created links within that website, the COVID Hub, to other reputable websites. So if people were concerned about the data they were getting on COVID in their own countries, they could link to the WHO website if they were concerned about specific issues. So we try to centralize information and make it free to access. And I think that was, I think as an impact, it went further than the types of pro bono we were doing before COVID.
Thanks very much, Aisha. And it brilliantly sort of brings us onto some of the lessons that we can start to draw out from some of the challenges that we've been facing. So thank you everyone for mapping out it seems like there are lots of common challenges, but also some distinct challenges in everyone's particular context. And if we move on to thinking about some of the lessons that we can draw out from those challenges, partly through the pandemic, but also thinking after the pandemic, what lessons we could take forward generally in coordinating pro bono. And I'm hearing, I think, some of the common themes are around the transition to virtual working and adapting to new and possibly slightly different funding models, and developing the idea of partnership working in this slightly different context. I wonder if, Phil, we could come back to you. You mentioned your shift to using virtual assistance models and a sort of hybrid model for coordinating pro bono. What lessons do you feel you can draw from that, thinking post-pandemic, hoping that we do get there?
Yeah, absolutely. And just before I talk about that, I just wanted to make one observation, which is that it's been interesting to hear about that some of the challenges from the other panelists was that actually it was a case of trying to convince the authorities to restart things and adapt and go to a virtual element, whereas actually our problem was the opposite. We were trying to stop them from doing it so quickly because there was a huge imperative, particularly on Lesvos, from the authorities' perspective, to restart the asylum procedure, because from their perspective, a delay was problematic. So they were really pushing to get the process restarted very quickly. And actually, from our perspective as legal organizations, far too quickly. in the sense that the framework wasn't there, the even basic COVID-19 compliance wasn't there, and conducting these remote interviews in a way that was not really appropriate or suitable. And so we had, ironically, the opposite issue of, you know, issuing press releases and things to try and pause the asylum procedure until a proper remote element could be put in place. But yeah, just to answer your question, I mean, we, in terms of lessons learned, we were faced with a pretty stark situation, because we either had to find a way of working remotely, or we would have had to just hugely reduce capacity, because our entire model was based on having volunteers coming in person. So that was particularly profound, given, as I mentioned, the need was even higher with more people going through the procedure and going through it quicker. So we pivoted to this initially a full remote model, and then now after a couple of months, we were able to resume in-person meetings. So we have now a hybrid remote model. And we were very skeptical of this to start with, to be honest. We had never done remote consultations, and our entire approach had been based on the idea that, you know, particularly in asylum cases, obviously in all legal cases, but particularly with asylum cases with such, you know, profoundly personal and often traumatic things being discussed, that you needed to be there in person to develop that rapport. But to be honest, we didn't really have a choice. So we had to find a way of trying to make it work. And now we have this hybrid model whereby the Greek lawyers remain in place in person. So they're the permanent team members, they will do the consultations in person. And then we have the pro bono lawyer usually assisting, joining the consultation remotely. So it's this hybrid element. We always make sure that there is at least one person there with the asylum seeker, whether it's the interpreter or interpreter plus lawyer. So it's never a purely remote consultation, because for that, I think it would break that personal linkage. And I mean, this was only possible with the obviously the assistance and the flexibility of all of the volunteer lawyers, both the asylum lawyers and the pro bono lawyers from the law firms. And in terms of lessons learned and opportunities, to be honest, we were completely, our initial expectation was 100% wrong. Our skepticism has now been, you know, turned the opposite way around. And, you know, if the pandemic was to magically end tomorrow and we could all go back to normal life, we would continue having this remote aspect along with the in-person element, because it actually enabled us to really increase our capacity and improve the services that we provided.
Thanks very much, Philip. It's a really interesting point you raise around skepticism. I wonder, Sarah, coming back to you, you know, I know your work at ISLB has largely been collaborative by design, and that during the pandemic, this has included community-led capacity building webinars. And so in some senses, it feels like there's a lot of opportunity there in this virtual space and virtual working. Could you share any lessons from along the way? And I'm also curious, did you have to shift from a similar skepticism in order to get there?
So I think the skepticism was a little bit different, because unlike Philip's work, where, you know, there was reason for being fearful about direct representation being done and privacy with the sensitive nature of asylum cases, we didn't face that necessarily, but we did face a skepticism about the value of just doing online virtual workshops, et cetera, because there's fatigue. Not everyone has access to stable internet connection. The very people that we were, you know, that we were trying to engage as participants and who were requesting some of this would still need to gather in groups that was sometimes prohibited under the lockdown restrictions. So it was not so much about skepticism of the model so much as how do we make this work? because we still wanted to be able to relay these workshops, but doing it, we had to just change it in terms of format, timing, and just be a lot tighter in terms of how we structured it. And there's not the same level of engagement that happens both informally and formally when you're doing it in person over a matter of days. So it was a different type of adaptation. I'd say lessons learned are there's a lot we can do virtually. And, you know, like everyone, we're learning, we're going to try to incorporate the bits that really worked for us and really to complement what we can do in person. And there are certain things that are more efficient and just less expensive for us to do virtually. And it really did expand the number of projects, for example, we did. We thought we would have a narrowing of number of projects. We actually, the number of hours of pro bono hours and number of matters, discrete matters, we had actually increased in 2020. I think there were a number of factors. I think our team was really just proactive in making sure we were engaging with people in a collaborative way. I think one of the biggest challenges, I think, was just on the tactical funding piece, realizing we rely on both individual contributions as well as foundations and development agencies on more project specific grants that we apply for that are, you know, it's restricted funding. And I think it is challenging in terms of when a funder is not flexible or adaptable in terms of how you can allocate those resources. If you can't, for example, and this is really just tactical, but I'm guessing some people on this call face similar or analogous issues. You know, if we're not doing an in-person project, there's still staff time, there are still expenses to doing it virtually. And there really was a spectrum in terms of funder adaptability in that regard, which I think is a challenge going forward, but also hopefully an opportunity for us as grantees to really work with them and help some of those lessons learned be translated into how we as nonprofits can really partner with these funders to be as responsive as possible to the real needs and as they change. And I think that's a shifting landscape that is, I know, of concern to many of us. And it's something that I don't think should be ignored in this greater conversation, is the funding piece of it.
And the shifting landscape, I think, is an important point and applies across the board. I mean, Mariam, I wonder, you've spoken a bit about the challenges, particularly the logistical challenges around adapting to a virtual environment with things around courts and representation. Did you feel that there have been opportunities or lessons learned? I mean, it's interesting, Phil mentioned that their work may stay in this sort of hybrid model even when things go back to normal. How does that fit with your experiences?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And actually, it was really interesting to hear Phil talking about the skepticism and also sort of adapting to that model. But just wanted to address a point that Aisha made earlier on about supporting your own team. And I think that that's something that we really did in terms of a lesson learned. And I've got 3 or 4 team members from Bangladesh, Nepal, and India on the call. Working together as a team was so important, and recognizing the fact that I might be sitting in London, but my colleague in Nepal will not have electricity for X number of hours, or my colleague in Delhi has just had to deal with a lockdown that happened overnight and they didn't have time to plan. So really empathy, and our team's been fantastic, and I know that other teams have also adapted across the board. And similarly, with a lot of the lawyers we were working with, some of them have kids at home. They don't have online access to, you know, working laptops, etc. So it's a lot of the same issues that Aisha mentioned. And I think it was important in terms of lessons learned. You know, we've learned to adapt, but that this sort of moves me on to your question, Emma, but it's not good enough. I mean, we're all saying, yeah, it's great that we can work online, but online is not a replacement for any of the in-person work that we can do. Certainly going forward, we do have to adapt and we do have to continue working online. But where one did find gaps and where lawyers or clients even found the gaps to be able to meet in person, we didn't have virtual coordination. We did try and meet in person where possible. And I think in terms of funders as well, I think it's really important to point out to funders that, yes, to a certain extent, if you have to, you can work online, but that's not a good enough sort of. I think what I'm trying to say is that I think a lot of funders are going to try and cut back on funding and say that you can do this online, and we have to sort of push back and say, well, actually, where we can work in person, we will continue to work in person. But having said that, a lot of our funders reached out to us as well and to other partners to find out how things were going and what they could do better as well. So that was also heartening. And yes, we certainly filled out a lot of questionnaires, and maybe things didn't happen after that, but we'll definitely continue to push funders to sort of ask us more questions to find out how they can support us. I think that my main concerns are also just things like, now that we do have virtual courtrooms, and Philip's sort of conversation got me thinking about that. That's all very well. And I know that in the UK, they want to keep virtual courtrooms going. In Delhi, for example, which is a fairly organized system compared to a lot of other places in India, they want to keep virtual courtrooms going. But again, it's not good enough for survivors of, say, for example, child sexual abuse or domestic violence, who won't get their proper time in court, supported by the right sort of people. You know, how are they going to give testimonies effectively? And also on the back of that, in terms of the court delays and pendency of cases that already existed before COVID, this has all just exacerbated it. So I'm not sure what the lessons learned there are. It's just, I think it is a matter of concern and something that we probably want to talk about. And just finally, yes, Sarah, sorry, I totally agree with you in terms of more pro bono hours being put in. A lot of lawyers contacted us who weren't necessarily in our community saying, actually, I've got a bit of extra time and I'd like to put in more pro bono hours. But at the same time, what we've realized is that pro bono doesn't always cut it in terms of litigation. So you do often have to offer lawyers maybe a reduced fee, or support with disbursements, whether it's photocopying or just being able to travel back and forth from a courtroom which is outside your main city, you know, those sort of things. So just maybe thinking about pro bono more creatively. I think that's something that definitely came up. Yeah, I think that's it. I don't want to take up too much time either, but thank you.
Thanks very much, Mariam. I think it'd be a great point to come back to Aisha, the sort of what Mariam was saying around the empathy and the emotional support that people need. And it's not just a question of legal needs or the legal work that they're doing. It sounded like some of those lessons with your work had been picked up quite early on. Is that something, well, I suppose firstly, was that the case? And are these, and the initiatives you talked about, are they signs of progress, or do you feel like there's still a lot of work to be done to sort of draw out some of the learnings from that?
I think that some of the challenges were quite apparent quite quickly. So in terms of people who needed financial support, that came out. What took a bit longer to emerge was mental health needs. So what we realized later was a lot of people are suffering from mental health issues, including our own staff members, and that this was something that wasn't necessarily talked about openly. So we talked a lot about physical health, you know, protecting yourself from COVID, washing your hands, staying at home, but we weren't necessarily talking about mental issues. And we became concerned about, you know, some of our maybe younger staff members who are isolated because they were used to sort of hanging out with their friends in the office and having a coffee. And some of these people who you might not think are vulnerable are actually suffering, we realized. And then it was hard to think of what systematic way could be put in place to help them. So what we started was, we started to offer counseling to our staff members. But now through something called the ELIL Academy, which is our educational charity, we put together with an external provider a mental health series. And it's something that we will run for the benefit of third parties as well as for internal consumption. And this is a much longer running series with with expert support. So we're lawyers, you know, we can talk the talk, but really, you know, we needed some expert advice in terms of supporting people with mental health issues. I personally think this is really something that we're going to have to continue, because we see the impact on children because of online schooling. I think there's going to be, you know, a lot of people who've held it together during COVID and been strong, who will need some support later when we're supposedly coming out of this, because they will then need to release some of their tension. So I think the mental health piece is important. And I think as lawyers, it's important for us to talk about mental health, because we're not a profession that talks about this openly. And I think we all think if I say it, I'll probably have a problem and I'll lose clients. But I think we need to talk about it much more as a community of lawyers, really. So I think the other thing we learned was flexibility. So we're very good about creating rules. Like if you want to engage with us, we need all this identification document about you, and we need to vet you. And we realized that this isn't going to work during COVID. You know, people weren't able to travel. We couldn't meet them face to face to verify stuff. And we started, you know, I mean, most of the people I know now, I have to talk to them on WhatsApp as well. They sometimes have limited Wi-Fi access. So we have to talk about how we, you know, they send me documents on WhatsApp and then I have to email them to my work address to print out. So we have to just be much more flexible about how we interact with people. And I think we honestly, as a profession, are very reluctant to move to what we consider non-professional ways of communicating. You know, so we thought, you know, like to protect myself, I must require you to write to me, you know, send me an email that's on my email address at work and tell me what your issue is and I'll confirm. And I just think we really had to get over that and start saying, we're going to work with you in the way that works for you and us. And for some people, that means a level of informality that we wouldn't otherwise accept. And now that we're used to this level of informality, I do think for some people, it's going to be very hard to roll back and say, we're now dealing with you in a very formalistic way. So I think that going forward, we will have to remain flexible. And I think, honestly, we do have to look after mental health for ourselves in the profession, as well as for people, because we were saying to each other, we're no good helping people if we ourselves are suffering. So we sort of have to look after ourselves, be resilient, and then be in a position to help others. And I don't know whether that's something other people thought as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point about mental health. And I think before moving on to sort of navigating the road ahead, I am curious about whether other panelists had insights or thoughts on that. I mean, feel free to jump in.
Sure, Emma, may I add something? Yeah, thanks. And actually, when Aisha started speaking about mental health, it brought up so many memories of last year of dealing with this and understanding how we could support not only our team, but our community of pro bono lawyers best. And in India, in particular, I think there were 2 suicides from within the legal community in the early days of COVID. And it sort of woke a lot of people up to starting to talk about mental health issues. And within iProbono, we actually started a group, or tried to start a group for lawyers, our community lawyers, to be in touch with social workers. And we offered group sessions, but also individual sessions in collaboration with one of our partners, Council to Secure Justice. And we ran one open session and then thought we'd have these smaller sessions. But actually what was very interesting was there was very little take up. I think partly because, as Aisha said, as lawyers, you're not geared towards your own, you know, really understanding that you might need to sort of support your own mental health or, you know, your colleagues. Of course, for clients, we were very aware of the fact that a lot of our clients, particularly the children, might need extra support. A lot of them were living in abusive situations. So it's a matter of delivering that kind of support to them where they are. But when it came to the lawyers themselves, there just was not a willingness to take it up. We are persevering with that in India to see what happens. Similarly, our equality law team in India was reaching out to the in Sri Lanka was reaching out to the LGBT plus community, because they're obviously different and similar issues that they were facing in terms of the kind of mental health support that they needed. Within our transgender communities as well, there were different types of support that we were trying to offer. And there was more of a take up there, but the lawyers really did interest me, because they just did not want, I mean, they just didn't reach out. So I think we have to go back to the drawing board on that one. Yeah, certainly food for thought. Philip, did you have something to add before we move on?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think it's a very, very important point, and I completely agree that it's something that as a profession, we're not really very comfortable in talking about. I mean, our situation on Lesvos was kind of exacerbated a little bit, because we were not only all the restrictions, but there was the lockdown as well, which meant that all of the team who were on the island all basically live in a series of apartments that we provide. So they were actually 24/7 with each other in a very, very intense situation, whilst also trying to provide assistance remotely, not being able to move around. And it was, yeah, as you say, these things have undoubtedly have a profound mental as well as physical impact. And just one thing I wanted to mention was that, you were talking about law firms doing other things and providing assistance in other ways. We were actually approached by Dentons, one of our pro bono partners in the Greece Pro Bono Collaborative, offering support. They approached and said, we have a mental health and wellness team. We'd like to offer you that assistance too, which, I mean, for us, it was fantastic. It was great that opportunity arose, because then we could give the lawyers the opportunity, and actually all the team members, the interpreters, everybody, that opportunity to speak to somebody outside of this situation. So we were hugely grateful for that. And I think it's a really great initiative that, coming from the law firm, coming from the pro bono partner. So yeah, I think it was, but absolutely agree. It's a very, very important point.
Great, thanks, Philip. I think that sort of moves us nicely on to thinking a little bit into the future and navigating the path ahead. And it feels like across all your organisations that mental health and emotional support is both part of the lessons that we've learned during the pandemic, but also critical to navigating the road ahead successfully in terms of continuing to coordinate pro bono. But thinking now a little bit more into the future, maybe coming back to Sarah, I think you've talked about some of the lessons that have come out of your work, but I know that there's always a challenge to translate some of those learnings then into practice and sort of move away from just the ideas or the theory behind what needs to change. So do you have any thoughts or advice or strategies about how you go about that with the organisation?
One of the things that we're doing, and as I believe Aisha was speaking about earlier, in the context of the crackdowns and on rule of law, is really putting front and center the intersectionality of different types of rights and work that need to be acknowledged. I think the pandemic obviously revealed the failures of so many public health systems, and that intersects so directly with economic development, with environmental sustainability. And at least in our work, we're being very cognizant and very pointed about noticing and building into projects, at the design of the projects, that intersectionality and observation of the intersection of those three, because that's what's relevant to the type of work that we do in economic development and the type of expertise that we can contribute. So that's on that piece. The second point is really being cognizant of the complementarity that can be achieved, not in all instances, but in many instances, of international law together with local law expertise. And at least for us, it's very much, since we're mobilizing lawyers from many different jurisdictions to work primarily in the global south, but typically we're bringing the international, in other words, non-local expertise, really making sure that we're finding opportunities to complement and enhance, and underscoring that we are not in a position, nor do we want to replace any local expertise, that there is a mutual learning that happens, but really being cognizant of the role that can be brought in with international law, whether it's, in our case, with freedom of expression and media freedoms, and with, for example, international best practices when it comes to environmental and designing, an infrastructure project or the like. And the third thing I would say is the multi-sector, the importance of that. The multi-sector approach, again, in the context of economic development, it became very clear to us that, whereas before our organization was very focused on government support to governments and support to civil societies, and increasingly we saw, that the private sector, especially as we see it in the global south, social enterprises, social entrepreneurs are a third pillar of creating a vibrant local environment that can be supported by the rule of law, but really making sure that those three are interacting and supported in a way that's constructive. Because just focusing on one or the other, at least, from our vantage point and for our mission, just is less than what we can do, which is supporting all of those different sectors. So practically speaking, that's how we are re-envisioning and sort of focusing even how we design our projects and how we're positioning ourselves in terms of establishing those partnerships and making sure that we're working constructively with our partners in a way that's optimal for them. I will say, going back to Aisha's point about the rule of law, I think one thing that has become increasingly concerning is the media crackdown. And so for us, practically, we are devoting more attention and time in terms of our media law working group to address some of the emergent issues that we're seeing in terms of dissident journalists and investigative journalists being jailed under spurious use of cybercrime laws. So that is something that we're also sort of reallocating some of our internal resources to respond to emergent needs that we're seeing that relate to our work.
Thank you. And yeah, it's a really important point that you mentioned around the rule of law, particularly in relation to media expression and journalists. But maybe a good point to come back to Aisha, is there, around that issue of the rule of law and the lessons that we've been talking about, how do you foresee that international networks and institutions will be able to, like Sarah mentions, think about partnership building and the design of the work in order to combat that as we move ahead?
I think that what is important is when we have international organizations or partners, that they build capacity locally. So what we see as a challenge is that a lot of focus on projects doesn't necessarily translate to long-term capacity building. And we realized quickly in Kenya that essentially we were on our own during our lockdown. And to a large extent, although we have long-term supporters, it was up to us to come up with, to help each other and come up with solutions. So I think when designing programs, and I like what Sarah said about, complementing each other. I think what's important is that there's a transfer of skills and as an expectation that essentially the locals will take ownership of a specific thing over a period of time, because for me, that's the only way you ensure sustainability. And for our firm, we essentially, our policy approach is that African problems require African solutions, which means that honestly, on the ground, we are the best placed people to understand context and to understand why something that might look like a good idea when it's designed in London may be doomed to failure here. So I think we see ourselves as part of a strong local coalition. And we actually find that our private sector clients are actually very interested in giving back to their communities. They see that strengthening of rule of law is actually helping the business climate. Everybody sees that. It leads them to make more money. So this is what we say to them. You want to make more money, make sure that, you know, there isn't a riot because people can't get food. So the way you do that is you help us build stronger local communities. And we find that the private sector are often in places like Kenya filling in the gap. So government isn't meeting basic obligations. And that means people like us are having to step in and say, what can we do? So on a basic example is we don't have enough COVID vaccines. We don't have them because, India stopped exporting under the COVAX scheme, and we were reliant on India. So essentially now the private sector in Kenya is saying to the government, we have our own networks and our own distribution channels. Allow us to bring in some of these vaccines and distribute them, not through the government, which is porous and prone to corruption, but through our own networks. And I think that we are learning to be much more resilient. And I think we have to, going forward, as much as we would like external support, I think we are increasingly realizing we have to learn to rely on each other locally. So that isn't to say that we don't want help, but for it to be sustainable, it has to be owned locally.
Thanks, Aisha. I think there's so much to unpack in what everyone is saying. And I'm aware that our time as panelists is starting to run out. So I just encourage participants, if you have questions about anything that's been said in the panel, to put them in the Q&A so we can pick them up in a few minutes. But moving maybe now to Mariam, I mean, I know you work very closely with networks of lawyers through iProbono. I'm wondering if you have thoughts around what lawyers need to know or to keep in mind if they want to get involved and tackle the challenges that we've discussed and that we see ahead.
Thanks, Emma. Yes, I mean, it's something that this is an issue that we've been thinking about in different contexts in the different countries that we work in South Asia. And obviously I'm speaking from a very South Asian perspective, but every jurisdiction is just so different. And I think the main concern is not only the crackdown on civil societies that we've been seeing across the board for a while before COVID, but the opportunity that COVID has given many of our governments to actually just shut down certain conversations, whether it's by, just by default, by the fact that courts have been shut, but just impinging on the right to protest, or, just not being able to access lawyers, etc. I think those are the kind of things that I feel our lawyers in our community need to be I think they're aware of it, but they need to collaborate more and talk about these things more, because I think there has been a closure of certain conversations, partly because of COVID, because people aren't able to meet, but also I think there's a feeling of helplessness across many of the jurisdictions that we're working in. So closer collaboration amongst lawyers. And it's interesting that Aisha mentioned sort of working sort of within different sectors and sort of turning to the private sector as well. And it's something that iProbono has been doing for many years, is working with in-house legal counsel, as well as your sort of usual suspect social justice, human rights lawyers, but trying to create collaboration so that lawyers in different spheres can support each other, taking forward this idea that social justice and human rights isn't only the remit of a human rights lawyer or a pro bono lawyer, if that makes sense. So I think that's something that we've kept in mind. And also, again, in the South Asian context, our borders have always been fairly closed, whether it's between India and Pakistan or Bangladesh and India, etc. And we feel that COVID has really closed the borders even further, particularly for our legal communities. So I guess going forward, we're all thinking about how we can open those proverbial borders, as it were, in the face of the necessary COVID lockdown. So I think that's going to be something for the legal community to think about as well.
Thank you. And talking of closed borders, Phil, your work has focused very heavily, particularly during the pandemic, on emergency response. And it's been great to hear about some of the lessons and the learnings that have come out of the need to adapt during the pandemic. But what do you feel the needs are for longer term sustainability to continue to effectively coordinate the work that you do?
Yeah, and thanks very much, Emma. I mean, I think that a lot of what everybody has said so far really resonates from our perspective too, in the sense that the distance and remoteness, which has been helpful in the last 18 months to ensure that we can actually keep working, can also threaten the rule of law. And, you know, we have seen in Greece in the last 18 months, much more restrictive asylum law. I mean, 10 days ago, a joint ministerial decision, which has completely changed the landscape in terms of asylum law, whereby now Turkey is considered a safe third country, not only for Syrians as it was before, but also for people from Afghanistan, people from Somalia, which is, you know, completely changed the whole situation. At the same time, there is a remoteness, an increased remoteness, physical remoteness, I mean, in the sense that there is a move towards putting people in camps that are more restrictive access and further physically from population centres to make it more difficult for lawyers to go there. So I think in that situation, it's a lot of things are taking place kind of invisibly or further away from access to from lawyers. So I think one of the big challenges is to trying to ensure that these things that have helped enable us work in the last 18 months don't become tools and mechanisms for actually restricting access longer term and threatening the rule of law long term. I mean, from our perspective, in a very practical sense, trying to ensure how to address the challenge of ensuring people can still access legal support, whether in person or remote, if they're actually in a situation where they can't leave the camp or can't easily leave a camp situation. So I think that these are, you know, we should be careful when it comes to these mechanisms, which have been very, very helpful and transformative in some sense over the last 18 months, that they don't have the long-term impact of really undermining the rule of law.
Thanks, Philip. I feel that we're nudging our way into the Q&A section, so it would be great to continue this conversation, but again, would welcome participants to put questions in the Q&A. We do have a couple, and I think they do relate to issues that all panelists have raised, so I'm not going to direct them to any particular panelist at this stage. There's one that's around vaccine equality and the connection between the vulnerabilities exposed by vaccine inequality and the human rights system more generally, and where civil society organisations stand when it comes to pointing to that inequality and being effective in global advocacy. Particularly, I think, you know, when a lot of CSOs have had to be fighting fire, how much potential is there to do thinking about what that means and what organisations and civil society more broadly needs to do. Do panelists have thoughts on where CSOs stand and whether enough has been done, what more can be done?
Emma, just very, very briefly. So in India, iProbono collaborated with a series of disability rights organizations to take forward a petition in the High Court regarding inequality and access to vaccines for certain categories of people with disabilities under specific Indian legislation. That petition's been clubbed together with two others brought forward by other CSOs. And because of delays within the court system, because there's lockdown, you know, across the courts, all our dates keep getting delayed. So I think there's a will, and I think there's an interest, and I think CSOs are collaborating on these issues. I don't know what's happening in other jurisdictions, but it's really hard to work against a court system which perhaps, you know, I think there has to be a willingness from within the judiciary as well to hear these matters, and everything's so political at the moment in India. It's, you know, as soon as you question the way that the vaccines are being rolled out, it's assumed that you're questioning the way in which the government is, you know, acting. And it's so complicated. So I think there's a will within civil society, but how that, you know, takes shape going forward, I have no idea. But it'll be really interesting to hear what's happening in other countries.
Thanks, Mariam. Did anyone else have thoughts on that question from the panel?
I think, sorry, it's not really civil society, but in Kenya, the media have been very active in highlighting the misuse of funds allocated to COVID. The fact that the elite have jumped the queues in terms of getting vaccinated before priority groups, and sort of spotlighting corruption surrounding COVID initiatives. And I mean, I think the media are doing a really good job. We have, you know, despite a lot of government efforts, we have a very vibrant press in Kenya. And I mean, honestly, they do a very good job of investigating and highlighting, you know, misuse of funds and things like that. So I think they're doing their bit. I think lawyers can do their bit, but the reality is whatever, I mean, we actually have a very supportive judiciary. So in Kenya, we have a judiciary that stands together with the common people as against the executive. And to a large extent, that's the reason why the judiciary budget was slashed by 2/3. So actually, we don't have a problem with the judiciary. They are as concerned as we are to protect each other. I think what I would say for me is that the practical issue in Kenya is we don't manufacture these vaccines. We don't. So whatever we do, ultimately, we are reliant on the support of external donors. And I think, you know, as difficult a situation that is, I mean, what we've turned to now is we've gotten donations from other African countries. So in South Sudan, they had a very low uptake of their own vaccines, and they agreed to donate them to Kenya before they expired, because otherwise they were going to go to waste. So I think maybe helping each other as neighbors is going to become more important. I wish we could have manufacturing capacity, but we won't. So.
Sarah, were you going to add something to?
I was very taken with what Aisha was saying, but just the vaccine manufacturing is critical. But I wanted to go back to the point I sort of alluded to earlier in terms of the intersectionality of these different sectors or the different themes in which many of us work. And you know, the right to health is not, you know, is not standalone, right? So when we talk about the human rights legal framework, et cetera, I think we do need to, at least as CSOs and, you know, CSOs generally, just acknowledging and making sure that it's more than just in theory, as you would say, noticing the intersectionality of the different areas, but really giving life to the right to health and public health systems, because we see what happens when one collapses, the economy collapses, and then there's the resource constraints. So governments and CSOs are so busy working on an emergency, and like we can't do everything at once. And so being aware of, I think, you know, centering public health and the right to health in terms of human rights, because the question is asking about the human rights system, I think is really critical. It's a time when for the first time people are really talking about the right to health in a different way and in common parlance. So I think we need to capture that moment and make sure that the right to health really does make its way into, you know, CSO advocacy across the board, whether it's, whether it's, immigration or economic rights or, working with something else. It really does impact each of us. So I would say it's a moment for the right to health to really take a greater platform internationally in terms of the human rights system. That was a little all over, but.
And Phil, I wouldn't want to move on without hearing your input. I think particularly as an organisation that's often sort of fighting fire, whether there's space and scope to think about things like developing the right to health.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously work on a much more micro level. You know, in terms of the camps in Greece, and something that struck me is, and it links to what Sarah said, which is that actually there was a lot of discussion in the last year, but you know, particularly kind of summer going into autumn time, when it was clear there was going to be a second wave in Europe and in Greece. There was a lot of information and discussion passed from the asylum seekers in the camp, saying to the organisations, look, please don't come to the camp unless you need to. Like, we know that the population is an at-risk population. We know that the health infrastructure, particularly on the islands, you know, it can't cope with the existing population. Never mind if there was going to be an outbreak in Moria or a camp like that. So what it struck me as quite an interesting pushback to the organisations working, to be like, well, actually, you need to find a way of operating that doesn't put us at risk, which, I mean, is pretty self-evident, but it's actually, it was interesting that was one of the major messages in terms of the awareness of the right to health was taking precedence over almost everything else at that stage. And that was linked in with an awareness of the lack of capacity of the health service to actually support if there was a major outbreak. I mean, from the perspective of the Greek government, there has been no manifest difference in terms of the vaccination of the Greek population compared to the camps. It was a bit slower in the camps, but they have been providing vaccines, and I think that's also an awareness of the pressure that it would create on the health service. So it's a very pragmatic approach taken. But yeah, I absolutely agree with what everybody has said so far.
Thanks, Phil. It's a really helpful perspective to add. Our next question is in particular around women and children who've experienced domestic violence during the lockdowns and the pandemic in general. And I think that the recognised spike in domestic violence during the pandemic around sort of these vulnerabilities and victims that are perhaps more financially vulnerable in terms of accessing legal services or funding defences. I could also broaden this question out to groups in general that any of the panelists do work with that have particular vulnerabilities in that respect. And I know Mariam has answered on the chat. If you're still on the line, I just give you an opportunity to speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, apologies. I'll be heading off a bit early, but yes, very quickly. So iProbono in India continued its program of providing support at representation at court to child survivors of abuse, and we also started our domestic violence work with women from different backgrounds and different jurisdictions in India. Mainly telephone counselling, actually, initially, because we found that we couldn't access a lot of the women in person. Particularly during the first lockdown. And this is all pro bono advice. But what we do at the trial court level, when we have in-house lawyers, but we also have panels of pro bono lawyers who are advocates with their own practices who want to be involved in pro bono work. We did start offering them small stipends to support the trial court work, because that's far more involved. We found that it was just more effective in getting the representation moving forward. We also found that actually the judges at the trial court level were giving more sensitive judgments than usual, and handing out interim compensation, which was fantastic. We got some really good results on certain cases. Also wanted to mention that another constituency that was really affected during the lockdown were slum dwellers who were being dehoused because of government circulars, and local developers were finding that COVID was a good time to push people out of their sort of, they call it temporary housing, but a lot of these people have been living there for like over 25 years. So that was another constituency that we did represent. Obviously difficult because we couldn't meet a lot of clients in person, but managed to provide pro bono support. But as I said earlier on, I think a mix of sort of pro bono and reduced fee work is a sort of good way forward in terms of providing representation at court to these vulnerable populations. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks very much, Mariam, and for staying as long as you could. And I'll open up to other panelists if they had anything to add to that, or from their own experience working with groups with particular vulnerabilities during this period.
We don't work precisely with victims and survivors of domestic violence in terms of that element of their case, although obviously that often plays a role in the asylum case generally. But something that has been an ongoing issue over the past 5.5 years or so, and indeed has been exacerbated by COVID, is in cases of violence, of abuse, is the lack of alternatives, particularly when it comes to accommodation, in the sense that where there are cases, and even cases that can be taken to court and followed through, there is then a difficulty in, and this has been exacerbated by COVID, in finding suitable alternative accommodation. So what often happens is that, and this goes for all elements of aspects of violence and abuse, that people often end up back in the same tent, in the same container as the person who committed the crime. Whether it's the next day or a few days later, once they're released from detention. And what we've seen again in the past 5 years, but during the last 18 months, is therefore a much greater reluctance to report, because people think, well, what's the point? I'm going to go to the police, I'm going to try and bring a case, nothing will happen, and it will create further problems for myself. At the same time, we've seen significant movements of transfers of people from the island camps to the mainland. 8,000 or so people in the last 6 months, and the issue is that a lot of the benefits that have been provided to people to try and support them have ended or will end, which results in people ending up being destitute on the streets of Athens and Thessaloniki with no alternative. And there is then a kind of this kind of catch-22 situation as well, because it puts more pressure on the CSOs, who, as we've mentioned before, are themselves under more pressure. So then it creates a big gap. And this applies to people of all vulnerabilities, with the reduced accessibility to medical support, reduced accessibility to legal assistance, and an increased reluctance, I think, in certainly amongst the people that we support in actually reporting issues, for a fear that it won't solve anything and may actually make the situation worse, which I appreciate is a perennial issue with cases like this.
Thanks very much, Phil. Aisha, I know that you've said quite a bit around sort of some of the barriers, if you had anything to add around this particular question.
I mean, we don't work directly with individual victims. What we do, for example, one of our pro bono projects is to support maybe education and advocacy around accessing medical treatment and contraception after abuse incidents, and trying to educate the police to support that, because often the police need a lot of education around these issues. And we know anecdotally just from the media that there has been a rise in teenage pregnancies from kids spending a lot of time out of school at home, and domestic violence cases. But I mean it's it's sad, but I think it is a reflection of the overall pressure on the society, I think. So unfortunately, I don't really have a solution to offer.
Thanks very much, Aisha. I don't think we have any more questions at the moment in the Q&A, which in some ways is fortuitous because I had a few that I didn't get to that I might put to the remaining panelists now. But if anyone does have any questions they'd like to ask the panelists, then please do continue to put them in the Q&A because we do have a few minutes left. But one was around this, we've talked a little bit about what the needs are and what the future might hold, but in terms of the resourcing and what logistically is needed in order to be able to scale some of these solutions and really effectively respond to these challenges. And I think particularly based on what panelists have said around sort of the role of the private and the public sector, as well as the international legal community, whether panelists had thoughts on that. And maybe coming, Sarah, to you first, because I feel like you have experience across various sectors and might have some insights.
Thanks for the question, Emma. I would echo what many of us have said in terms of adaptability and flexibility, just as we have, pivoted in our own work to respond to emerging needs. I think on the funding side, and this is something I spoke with about with Abshir, our A4ID organizer of this panel, that I think a constructive conversation with some funders would be great because the landscape has changed. Many are restructuring and, reassessing their needs and strategy, which, of course, makes sense. But I think on the funding side, adaptability is really critical because without it, we just can't do our work and we can't be responsive. And it's just not, we can't be responsive to the real needs on the ground. It's just, it leads to mission creep and it's just not an effective way to use resources. So that's what I would say in terms of what is needed in funding. So I would say allowing, just more flexibility.
Yeah, I think.
And greater transparency. Sorry.
Flexibility is and transparency are both really important points. I wonder, maybe Aisha, coming back to you on this one, I know that you've been thinking about resources, but what sorts of conversations are going on in terms of resourcing and the sort of institutional level, thinking ahead?
One of the things we think is a problem, obviously there's something called donor fatigue. So we are finding it, I think the people we help find it increasingly difficult to attract grants. And I know a lot of people I know in the NGO space have actually lost their jobs because of cuts to funding. But we ran a panel yesterday and it was called the A to Z for compliance for NGOs, and it was just trying to give really practical tips to maybe smaller NGOs who didn't have a lot of resources to deal with compliance, to help them sort of improve their compliance framework so that they could actually make themselves more credible and more likely to attract funding. So I think that's something very practical. So as a resource, I think what needs to be done is to help people strengthen particularly financial controls. So a lot of people who are doing very good work don't understand what type of frameworks they need. And even if they did, they wouldn't be able to dedicate resources to building good compliance systems, controls, financial controls, auditing. And if there was some way for donors to assist with building that capacity or, providing that template or framework, I think that would go a long way to ensuring sustainability, because I don't think the funding will increase. I think we're all chasing smaller and smaller pies and a smaller share of the smaller pie. So I feel that getting value for money is even more important during these times. And one of the ways to get value for money is to be obviously much more prudent about how you actually use an account for your own money. So I think financial health resources and auditing, that's a good area for people to focus. And I spoke earlier about capacity building, and this is an area where I think we could do with more capacity building actually. And even from the government side, who are terrible at accountability, they actually do need more support from organizations like, multilateral lenders about even strengthening their own controls. And then maybe that can cascade down to recipients. But I think that it's often overlooked. So people want to give money and they want to see that it's going to the person on the ground, and maybe the control is the missing element there.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, I think you had something you wanted to add to Aisha's comments.
Yeah, one really quick point is one of the most effective and helpful things our organization experienced during this is funders who really lowered reporting, sort of the burden of reporting. And I see Philip shaking his head. I mean, that takes up a huge amount of resources. So I think one very practical thing that donors can do in the spirit of what Aisha is saying in terms of capacity building among grantees is giving very clear guidance in terms of reporting and lowering some of that reporting burden, especially in times like this of crisis. I thought that was fantastic, how some people really, some organizations really were incredibly good about that.
Thanks, Sarah. And that is a really important point. It's not just the grant making, but it's the logistics around how that works, particularly in times of crises. And we do, I mean, Philip, you may have things to add to that point. We also have another question in the Q&A, and it goes to Aisha's point slightly around shrinking pots of money, about thoughts on legal aid becoming more politicized. And Philip, that does feel like that would be quite integral to some of the issues that you're facing in particular. So I'll pass any of those questions in your direction.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I have nothing to add to what Sarah said, other than I completely agree. It was like a Christmas present when donors would write and say, okay, we've decided we're going to reduce what you need to report on, and I think that shows a huge amount of understanding. I mean, obviously they're under the same pressures as we are, but it was a relief, certainly in certain situations. Yeah, in terms of legal aid being politicized, well, we've only got 5 minutes left. I'll do my best. I mean, we have seen in Greece over the last 5 years that there is supposed to be the provision of legal aid by the state for the appeal stage, and that has consistently not been realised. It's one of those issues whereby, you know, we're fighting to fill a gap that shouldn't exist. So from our perspective as an organisation, well, I suppose I should contextualise by saying that the legal aid provided in Greece, theoretically, is for the appeal stage only. So there's nothing for first instance in the asylum procedure, which is fundamentally problematic. I mean, we as an organisation believe that it's a fundamental right for every asylum seeker to have legal assistance from the beginning through to the end. Yet we're striving to fight to you know, have the bare minimum actually realised in terms of the appeal first instance assistance, legal aid. And I mean, from our perspective as an organisation, we don't want to exist. We think we shouldn't exist. We think that this should be provided as a robust mechanism by the state, whereby everybody has access to an independent lawyer throughout the procedure. But of course, you know, you're absolutely right that legal aid, particularly, and refugee issues, certainly in Europe, are a highly politicized issue, and it's a very sad issue from my perspective. You know, when you think of the numbers involved, we're talking 100,000 people in Greece, 150,000 people, which, you know, being very aware that I'm on a global panel now is an incredibly small number. Yet it has become one of the biggest, you know, political hot potatoes within the European Union. I remember speaking to somebody who was working in Moria with the authorities from Sweden, and he said that he thought it was shameful that there were 25,000 people in Moria, because, you know, within the European context, because if that number was spread equally across just the municipalities in Sweden, it would be only 5 people per municipality, which just, I think, illustrates what a tiny number it is. Yet it has become a situation whereby we have become totally and utterly normalized in Europe to the issue that there will be 20, 30,000 people living on the Aegean Islands for 2-3 years in squalid conditions in temporary tents, and that the idea that those people should be provided with a lawyer to help help them realize their basic rights is somehow a controversial topic, which is a very damning situation. Speaking as a proud European rather than as a British person, or maybe as a British person as well, that the fact that is even a topic for discussion, rather than just an absolute accepted reality, and well, not reality, an accepted truth, a truism that everybody going through any legal procedure, but particularly one like the asylum procedure, should have a lawyer from beginning to an end, is a very sad situation. And it's very sad that it's become so normalized that people don't, and people live in these conditions.
Thanks very much, Philip. And it feels like this could be the subject of a whole separate panel discussion. So maybe thought for next year's conference. But I'm aware that we're counting down the seconds, so I'll thank the panelists so much for all of their contributions and pass back to Aisha for any final comments before the next session.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you all for your contributions. I found your insights to be quite poignant, and as just mentioned, this sounds like it is going to be part of a continued conversation, and that I'm glad that we've added a letter to that page, and I'm hoping that we can continue to keep this dialogue going, and perhaps maybe something for next year to consider from this session. But I wanted to just let everyone know that we have a session starting in around a minute where we're hoping to provide some guided breathing and stretching exercises for people who have been at the conference since the beginning. And that should be in the chat box at the moment if you wanted to take part in that. And straight after that, we have 2 sessions, one on climate litigation, a rule of law approach to climate justice, and another on global health and pro bono, the universal right to health in COVID-19, which you could also take part should you wish. But I really wanted to emphasize thank you all for attending, and thank you to all speakers, and to Emma for chairing this esteemed panel. I will now close the webinar, and I'm hoping our paths cross soon, if not virtually in person at some point in the future. Excellent. Bye, everybody.